Ricky-O, here we go.
Day 21. Start answer. Security deck. Shift 1. Kenneth Rowland had been locked up for the last 3 years as he had gone through first the indictment process, then trial and the ultimate conviction that had resulted from that process, and now transport to 27 where he had been sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life. 27 was a rough prison, or so he had read. You didn't just happen to stumble upon someone who had spent a bunch of time there. You couldn't read a book about it to prepare yourself either. The only route to understanding was reading past news articles about the facility or facilities like it, but even then it was usually watered down. Experience in a place like 27 was something you didn't live to tell about. In some ways that was all that mattered to him, in other ways it didn't matter at all. He had no intention of ever finding out what time in a supermax facility like 27 was like. He intended to avoid it or die in the process of trying to avoid it. He paced his cell counting off the steps. The count meant nothing, at least the total of steps meant nothing. What did matter was the repetition. Keeping his mind occupied with something trivial as he thought over the bigger part of the problem, and the bigger part of the problem was how to get from the subsection he was in to the main bubble. Topside where he could seize control of this tub. He paused at the bulletproof glass set into the cell door and peered out at the bubble, a smaller octagon of black carbon composite that he knew housed an even smaller control room. Door lock panel, cell monitors, and intercom systems. From that small space, one CO could easily keep track of 8 inmates. He moved back from the door and returned to pacing, aware that the CO just might be watching him on a monitor as he did. There were 3 others he had been bought in with, all in this same complex, he assumed. Although he was not supposed to know it, he knew there were 8 cells here in an octagon layout with the one control room in the center to keep track of all the cells with monitors. Central hallways bisected the octagon north to south and west to east. The control bubble sat in the center so that the CO had line of sight as well as camera views of the inmates in the cells. The cells were far from silent. Muted conversations from other places, maybe other cells, maybe other areas of the ship. The ventilation system connected to all areas of the ship, at least all areas that were lived in, a cheap, fast retrofit compromise on the old intra-class cruisers. Something he should have no way of knowing anything about. Something he would have no way of knowing except he had worked for over 10 years on Moon 14 doing these sorts of retrofits himself. 13. He had given that no thought as he had begun the process that had brought him to this day. He had been guilty. He had known he would be found guilty. He had simply been hoping for a way out, searching for a loophole that would get him out of it. None had come his way. He thought back on the circumstances that had brought him to this day. 2 years ago he had been drinking at an unauthorized bar on 14 one night after a double shift. The Lift was a popular place that featured robo-partners and earth-brewed beers, usually hard to come by, at rock-bottom prices. In court they had made a big deal about both the robo-partners and the supposed earth beer. The earth beer was relabeled low-grav brew, barely fit to drink, and the robo-partners were Chinese knockoffs. The jury had cared more about the fact that live men were having sex with robots than they did that they were Chinese knockoffs. And of course the fight that had resulted in one of the other patrons' death. Federal law required vid links in all public places. There had never been any hope of avoiding that. The thin hope he had was that the audio portion would be bad. It hadn't been. There had been no mistaking his drunken threats during the evening, and the resulting fight he had ended with a thrust from a line pick. A tool used to start fish holes for pulling wire through steel wall panels. One thrust with a line pick opened a small pinhole in a steel construction panel. It also implanted a small explosive charge that widened the hole and deposited the debris from that explosion inside the steel panel where it could not cause problems in the ship. He had been angry when he had lashed out with the line pick, not really thinking about what he was doing. The man had come at him with a broken beer bottle. A weapon was a weapon, wasn't it? As it turned out, the jury didn't think so. He had struck out with the line pick, buried it, and then he had pulled the trigger. The truth was, he had meant to pull the trigger. He had envisioned the small explosion driving the man back and ending the fight. Instead, the line pick had malfunctioned because of the soft tissue and had injected multiple explosive pellets. They had all been set off when the first one exploded. The explosion had blown a large hole straight through his chest and exited his shoulder blade, spraying the bar with blood and bone as it had. The man had somehow lived for nearly a full minute before his eyes had finally slipped shut. The prosecutor had asked for the death penalty. Offered a choice of life in or death, he would have gone for the death. The jury felt life in was a better punishment, and if he had to actually spend life in, they would be right. He had no intention of doing that, though. Midway through the trial, he had suddenly remembered about the ventilation system. A smuggled-in paper book had offered complete schematics on intra-cruisers. 14. The rest of his plan had been formed in one sleepless night. Before the jury had finished its deliberations, he had been in contact with Randy Best, a friend he had worked the shipyards with. He had worked with Randy for more than 6 years. He knew him better than his own wife did, far better. Randy liked money, credits. It was the one thing that spoke directly to his conscious mind. Kenneth had plenty of legal credits, but the transfer of legal credits could be traced, so he had used one of the illegal accounts he had set up years ago for overtime. The unions frowned on overtime, but ironically they worked with the same people that could get you a fake account. A fake account that was so good you couldn't tell it from the real thing. Spending those credits was a little tougher. You needed the proper ID. Kenneth had 3 fake accounts. His rainy day fund, he had called it, and if it wasn't raining right now, he didn't know what the hell it was doing. Randy had come for a visit at the federal holding jail. Nothing unusual there. They were co-workers. He had offered the smallest account for Randy's help. Randy had made a counter offer that had brought all of his illegal credits to the table. No matter. They would be useless to him in prison. He had already written them off before he had realized they might be better than gold. Payment for services that could not be traced. What could be better? Nothing. Within days, he had taken a calculated risk and had Randy paid to transfer to the Start Answers crew list. A few credits in the right place had put him first on the list in case someone pulled out. He had made sure he placed first on the replacement list for the only other intra-cruiser leaving within his estimated time frame, Old Gray. He had men on either ship ready to sign off the Fed crew they were assigned to at a moment's notice. More credits, but completely worth it to guarantee an in on either ship. It wasn't really a guarantee. Something could go wrong, but it was as close as he could get to one. Randy would be on either ship when it sailed. 2 weeks before the verdict had come down. Both ships had come in over a 48-hour period, and they had paid the bribes, and Randy had taken up his position on both lists. There had been things that could have gone wrong, but they had not, and there had been backup plans they had not needed. They had been underway a few weeks now. Randy had not made himself known, but Kenneth had no doubt that he would do his job. In order to collect the balance of his credits, he would need the one remaining account number Kenneth had memorized. If he didn't follow through, he wouldn't get the credits. Kenneth slowed his pacing at the glass port, looked out at the bubble, smiled, and then went back to pacing. The rest of the plan was simple. Randy would get him free after releasing gas into the air system that would knock out the entire crew, security, and ship crew. 15. He didn't know when it would come, probably later at night. He would know it was coming because he would receive a set of small nasal filters with his meal. It meant inserting those filters into his nose, keeping his mouth closed as he breathed and waiting out the gas. The meals had come every day for the last several days with nothing. This morning he had decided this meal too would be empty. Some sort of ready to eat. He had prepared the bowl, torn open the seasoning packet, and had just been about to sprinkle it over the bowl when he had caught a glint of light on stainless carbon. He had gone through the motions of sprinkling the package over the bowl and then setting it aside. A few moments later he had turned away from the camera after finishing his meal and inserted the nose filters carefully yet quickly. He had pushed the remains of his dinner into the disposal chute, sat down on the edge of his bunk and waited. Petra Stanovich. Deck 0. Crew quarters. Petra lay back on her rack, drifting in and out of a light doze.
If you need another sandwich, let me know.
Music played through her headphones. The routine on board Stardancer was hard to get used to. Hard to get used to because of all the things you had to do to keep yourself busy. After life in the military and then 13 months out of field working in a dry dock facility, she was not used to downtime. On a military transport there were crew shifts. You were in rotation from the day you were added to the squad, and you did not leave rotation until you were transferred from the ship to some other service quadrant. In the dry dock facility she had worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, banking credits. The one day she had off was every bit as hectic as her weekday workload. 13 months had gone by quickly. Here days went by at the slowest pace she had ever experienced. Mike, who had dealt with the lifestyle for years, had found ways to fill that time. She had taken a few tips from him. She would like to take more. She was concerned about seeming as though she were capitalizing all of his time, but the truth was that she actually liked spending time with him and learning from him. She felt the light air movement from the blowers as it crossed her face, still thinking about Mike, wondering what exactly her true feelings were. Her thoughts seemed to be expanding, flowing around and around as she tried to think through them. Tired, she thought. It was the first shift, so morning, and she was already tired from boredom. The thought made her laugh aloud. Her own voice seemed strange to her, alien, muffled. She realized she was drifting towards sleep and tried to rouse herself, pushing up to her elbows. Sleep was not on the horizon. She had a log entry to prepare after a systems check and then a scheduled maintenance thruster maneuver later on. 16. She had half-formed the thoughts while pushing up into a sitting position with her hands. Something was wrong. Her equilibrium was way off. Her mouth was suddenly too dry. Her head seemed to have a pulse of its own all at once. She made it halfway up to a sitting position before she sagged back down to the bed. Stardancer. Federal Security. Cell block. Randy Best raced down the exterior hallway watching for the teeth that would split off and take him from the octagon where Kenneth Rowland had been locked down. He had set him free. Now they only needed to make it to the L banks without being caught. The plan, so far, had gone off mostly without a hitch. He had dumped CO2 into the air system, the gas he had promised Ken he would use. After all, carbon monoxide was a gas, at least in the form he had used it. He had thought of CO2 pellets, but they would be detectable and readily missed from the ship's inventory, and being detected would end the whole operation before it even began. He had released Ken and headed directly to the octagon. Ken had been waiting on the door. He had swung the door wide and began backtracking to the closest exit before the door had bounced off the wall with a loud bang. He had assumed Ken was right behind him. He had made the door, turned to tell Ken to move it, and the door had slid shut on its track just that fast. The brief look he got showed an empty corridor. Ken must have gone in the other direction for some reason. His heart skipped a beat and then settled down once more. His pulse was run away, pounding in his ears, but the mask was secure. None of the carbon monoxide was leaking in. He turned after a brief pause and sprinted off down the corridor. They would have to meet up in the main corridor on the other side of the bubble. It amazed him how easy it had been. Not, he told himself, that he had doubted it would go as Ken had said. Ken had researched it. He knew what he was doing. He was placing his entire future on it, and that was the only reason that Randy had placed his future on it too. And it would be his future if he was caught. There was a federal troop presence on this ship, and that meant it was technically an escape within a federal facility. Life without, no chance of ever seeing the world again if they were caught. He rounded a slight curve and found the T. A second after finding it, he was pounding down the outer corridor, the echoes of his footfalls loud in the absolute quiet. The hallway curved as did all the hallways on the ship. He sensed something before he saw anything, and he had broken his stride immediately, sucking a deep breath and skidding to a stop, the stolen taser pistol coming up. He fired as soon as the two workers came into sight. The one fell, and the other jumped away, slipping back around the corner. He never heard the one behind him. One moment he was standing, slightly crouched, and the next he was falling. 17. An explosion of confusion suddenly dominating his thoughts. A split second later the pain crashed into him hard, driving all other thoughts from his head. A split second after that the lights went out and he crashed to the floor, bouncing on the carbon composite floor panel and sliding slightly forward before the furrows in his brow flattened out and he relaxed completely onto the floor. Clear. The guard that had fired the taser shot called out. "Who are you?" A voice called back. "Pratt. Badge T89Y." The other man stepped around the corner, rifle held high, sweeping from side to side. Jesus, what the hell is this? His eyes fixed on Pratt. He had seen him around the mess a few times. He had something to do with cargo, at least he was sure that was where he had seen him. Not a clue. Heard the shots, came running. How is it you managed to escape the gas or whatever it is? Hull breach? Maybe. Alarm went off and I grabbed an emergency mask. There were 3 of us, 2 of us made it in time. You think we hit something? Or something hit us, right? Has to be. Pratt reached down, pulled the body closer, and then pulled the man's arms back one by one. He used plasticuffs and secured his hands behind him. He keyed the comm button on his wrist implant, released it, and looked up first. Did you call it in? Is the secretary calm? Up? Spoke to him, he is. Pratt keyed his comm button once more. T89Y, he listened to the clean, low crash of static. Base. Base, this is T89Y. Baylor, came the answer. Operations are thin, repeat thin. What is your situation, T89Y? Got a bad guy, myself, and he glanced over at the other man, reading the tag on his uniform, Baker. The man wore no badge. We don't know the circumstances here. We have one down, taser pistol. He kicked the taser pistol a little further away from the body, gripped the back of the man's jumpsuit, and turned him over. Best, that's the name of the bad guy. He rifled his pockets and found nothing but a set of keys. Keys in his pocket, he flipped the small set of keys from side to side. They were shaped funny. Nothing he had seen before. Octagon, Baker said. He keyed his own comm link. Octagon keys, for the bubble and the cells. He released the comm link. Where the hell did this guy get a set of lockups from? Jesus. The other man, Baker's partner, began moving around on the floor, groaning. A second later he sat up, rubbing at his temples. The comm link squawked static and then Baylor's voice came through clear. All stations. All stations. One by one in post order, reporting so we know what we are dealing with here. Station by station the call-in proceeded until there were none left to call in. 3 two-man crews had not called in and were presumably out. All stations. All stations. The report I have says we had an exhaust dump into our air supply, which means CO2 in heavy concentrations.